The mansion was supposed to be asleep. Nuella's hands trembled as she pushed open the heavy front door at 2:47 a.m., the sound of rain still drumming in her ears. Her burgundy dress clung to her skin, damp from the storm she'd run through. Her very long black hair, usually pulled into a neat ponytail for work, hung loose and wild around her shoulders. Mascara traced dark rivers down her brown cheeks. She just wanted to disappear into her small room. To pretend this night had never happened. Her fingers found the light switch. The chandelier blazed to life, and her heart stopped. Kang Jae-min sat motionless on the black leather couch in the center of the living room, a crystal glass of whiskey balanced in his hand. His shoulder-length wavy black hair fell partially across his face, but it didn't hide his eyes. Those dark, burning eyes that pinned her in place like a butterfly to a board. He'd been waiting. In the dark. "Mr. Kang," her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Where were you?" His voice was silk wrapped around steel. Deathly calm. Terrifying in its control. Nuella's throat closed. She couldn't answer. Couldn't breathe. Her hand instinctively rose to her neck, fingers covering the spot that suddenly felt like it was on fire. His gaze followed the movement. Everything changed. Jae-min's eyes locked onto her neck, onto the dark purple mark her fingers couldn't quite hide. His jaw clenched so hard she heard his teeth grind. The glass in his hand began to shake. "What is that?" Not a question. A demand. I can explain." "Explain." His voice exploded through the mansion like thunder. He surged to his feet, and the crystal glass flew from his hand, shattering against the marble wall with a sound like a gunshot. Whiskey splattered across white stone, the liquid running down like amber blood. "You have a hickey. You were with a man." Nuella flinched, tears already spilling over. "Please, just listen." "How long?" He advanced toward her, and she'd never seen him like this. In 3 months of working here, Kang Jae-min had been cold, distant, untouchable. Now he was a storm given human form. "How long have you been sneaking out to spread your legs for some?" "It's not like that." The words ripped from her throat. "Then what is it like, Nuella?" Her name on his lips sounded like a curse and a prayer. "Tell me what it's like when you come home at 3 in the morning with another man's mark on your neck." A side table crashed to the floor. He'd shoved it without even looking, his eyes never leaving her face. The sharp scent of whiskey filled the air, mixing with the expensive cologne he always wore and something else, something wild and dangerous she'd never smelled on him before. Jealousy. But that was impossible. He was Kang Jae-min, corporate titan. Underground king. A man who looked through her like she was glass. Wasn't he? "I trusted you," he said, and his voice had gone quiet again. Somehow, that was worse than the shouting. "I let you into my home." Into my, he cut himself off, jaw working. "And this is what you do?" "You don't understand," she was sobbing now, hands still pressed to her neck, trying to cover the evidence of her humiliation. The evidence of how stupid she'd been. "No. I understand perfectly." His eyes were black ice. "You're just like all the rest." The words hit harder than any physical blow could have. Jae-min turned away from her, his broad shoulders rigid beneath his unbuttoned white dress shirt. He walked toward his bedroom with measured, controlled steps, but she could see his hands shaking. Could see the tension radiating through every inch of his muscular frame. "Mr. Kang, please." The bedroom door slammed so hard the chandelier shook. The sound of the lock clicking into place echoed like a gunshot in the sudden silence. Nuella stood frozen in the ruins of the living room. Shattered glass glittered on the marble floor like stars that had fallen from the sky and broken on impact. The whiskey stain spread across the wall, dark and accusing. She sank to her knees, hands still covering her neck, and finally let herself break. She'd come to Seoul to escape one nightmare. She hadn't realized she'd be walking straight into another. If you're hooked already, smash that like button and subscribe, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and trust me, the truth behind that hickey will destroy you. 3 months earlier. Nuella had arrived in Seoul with nothing but a battered suitcase and a promise she'd made to herself: survive, no matter what. The airport had been overwhelming, a maze of Hangul characters she couldn't read, voices speaking a language that sounded like music she'd never learned to play, and the crushing weight of being utterly, completely alone. She was 22 years old, and she'd just fled the only home she'd ever known. Her father's funeral had been 3 weeks before the debt collectors came. They'd shown up at her family's small house in Lagos with smiles that didn't reach their eyes and documents bearing her father's signature. Money he'd borrowed. Money he'd promised. Money that, with interest, had grown into an impossible mountain her mother could never climb. "Your father made promises," the man in the expensive suit had said. "Someone has to keep them." The agency had felt like salvation. Domestic work in South Korea, they'd promised. Good pay. Safe housing. A chance to send money home. They hadn't mentioned the man she'd be working for. Kang Jae-min. She'd researched him during the long flight. CEO of Kang Industries, a shipping and logistics empire that controlled half the ports in East Asia. "I am 32 years old. Never married. Rarely photographed." The articles described him as brilliant but ruthless and intensely private. They didn't mention what he looked like in person. When she first saw him, standing in the marble foyer of his mansion with his shoulder-length wavy black hair and sharp jawline, wearing a suit that probably cost more than her father's debts, she'd forgotten how to breathe. He was beautiful in a way that felt dangerous, like a blade with too sharp an edge. He'd barely glanced at her. "Mrs. Huang will show you your duties," he'd said, his voice devoid of emotion. His dark eyes had slid over her like she was furniture he'd just purchased. "Don't disturb me unless the house is on fire." Then he'd walked away, and Nuella had understood, she was invisible to him. Mrs. Huang had been different. The elegant older woman with gray hair and kind eyes had taken Nuella under her wing immediately. "Don't mind him, dear," she'd said warmly. "He's always been this way. Raised him myself after his mother passed, and the boy learned early to keep his heart locked up tight." "Why?" Nuella had asked. Mrs. Huang's expression had darkened. "Women see his money before they see him. Every last one. There was one, 3 years ago. Beautiful thing. He actually thought she loved him." The older woman had shaken her head. "She tried to poison him to steal his corporate documents. Nearly succeeded, too. He hasn't let anyone close since." Nuella had felt an unexpected stab of sympathy for the cold man upstairs. The mansion became her entire world. She cleaned rooms larger than her family's entire house. She learned to prepare Korean meals she couldn't pronounce. She moved through the space like a ghost, always careful to stay out of Jae-min's way. But Seoul itself was lonely in ways Lagos had never been. She missed the chaos of home, the markets bursting with color, her mother's laughter, the familiar rhythm of Yoruba mixing with English. Here, everything felt muted. Sterile. She couldn't read the signs. I couldn't understand the conversations happening around her when she went to the market. At night, she cried into her pillow, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. That's when the small kindnesses started. The first time she fell sick with a fever, she dragged herself to work anyway, terrified of losing this job. That evening, she'd found a bowl of samjitang, chicken ginseng soup, sitting outside her door. Still steaming. No note. Mrs. Huang swore she hadn't made it. After a particularly difficult night when homesickness had kept her awake until dawn, she'd found fresh flowers in a simple vase on her windowsill. White lilies. Her favorites, though she'd never told anyone. When her phone broke and she couldn't afford to replace it, a new one appeared on her bed. Again, no note. She asked Mrs. Huang. The older woman smiled knowingly but said nothing. Nuella started watching Jaemin more carefully after that. He never spoke to her beyond brief instructions. Never looked at her directly. But sometimes, when she was cleaning his study, she'd feel eyes on her back. When she'd turn, he'd be staring at his computer screen, jaw tight, as if he hadn't just been watching her. Once, she'd slipped on the marble stairs, her arms full of laundry. She'd braced for impact, but strong hands had caught her waist, steadying her. Jaemin had been there, his face inches from hers, those dark eyes finally looking directly at her. For 3 heartbeats, neither of them had moved. Then he'd released her like she'd burned him and walked away without a word. But that night, there had been chocolate outside her door. Expensive Swiss chocolate. The kind that melted on your tongue. Nuella began to realize something that both thrilled and terrified her. Kang Jaemin noticed everything about her. He just pretended not to. And she, God help her, had started noticing everything about him too. The way his hair fell across his forehead when he was tired. The rare ghost of a smile when he thought no one was watching. The tension in his shoulders when he came home late from whatever mysterious business he conducted. Mrs. Huang had mentioned, almost casually, that his company was legitimate, but his connections ran deeper. There are things even I don't ask about, child, she'd said quietly. Powerful men in this country don't stay powerful by playing fair. Nuella should have been afraid. Instead, she found herself leaving coffee on his desk, exactly how he liked it. Found herself learning to cook the foods he preferred. Found herself straightening his tie in her mind when she saw it slightly crooked. 3 months of invisible care exchanged between 2 people who never spoke about it. 3 months of pretending she didn't feel her heart race when he entered a room. 3 months of carefully maintained distance. Until tonight, when everything had shattered like crystal against marble. Nuella's room had never felt smaller. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, still in her damp burgundy dress, staring at nothing. The mansion had fallen silent after Jaemin's door slammed, but the echo still rang in her ears. Her hand pressed against her neck, covering the mark that had destroyed everything. The hickey felt like it was burning through her skin. 3 weeks earlier, the nightmare had begun so sweetly. She'd met Victor at the International Community Center in Itaewon, a place where expats and immigrants gathered to feel less alone. He was Nigerian too, from Port Harcourt, with an easy smile and warm eyes that reminded her of home. When he'd approached her during the language exchange, she'd been so grateful to hear pidgin English again that she'd almost cried. Sister, you look like you need better friends than these Korean textbooks, he'd teased, and she'd laughed for the first time in months. Victor had seemed different from the Korean men who stared at her in the streets like she was exotic rather than human. He'd asked about her family, her dreams, her fears. He'd listened when she talked about missing her mother's jollof rice and the sound of rain on Lagos rooftops. You deserve better than being someone's maid, he'd said during their 3rd meeting. You're too smart, too beautiful to be invisible. He'd made her feel seen. Tonight, he'd taken her to a restaurant she could never afford, soft lighting, wine she couldn't pronounce, his hand reaching across the table to hold hers. I'm falling for you, Nuella, he'd whispered. I know it's fast, but I can't help it. Her heart had soared. After months of being invisible in Jaemin's mansion, someone finally wanted her. When he'd invited her to his apartment, she'd hesitated. But his eyes had been so sincere, his touch so gentle. Only if you want to, he'd said. No pressure. She'd wanted to feel wanted. Just once. His apartment had been small but neat. They'd talked on his couch, and then his lips had been on hers, and everything had happened so fast. His mouth on her neck, leaving that mark. Her dress coming off. His hands. She'd excused herself to the bathroom to breathe, to process, to convince herself this was real. That's when she'd heard his voice through the thin walls. Yup, the bet's done. Victor's laughter had been bright, casual. I told you I could get the African maid to fall for me. 3 weeks. Money's mine, bro. These foreign girls are so desperate for attention, easiest 500,000 one I ever made. The world had tilted sideways. Nuella had gripped the bathroom sink, her reflection in the mirror fracturing into 1,000 pieces. She'd walked back into the living room on autopilot, fully dressed, purse in hand. Victor had still been on the phone. When he'd seen her face, he'd hung up slowly, smirking. You heard that, huh? Was any of it real? Her voice had been so small. Come on, Nuella. He'd shrugged, not even ashamed. Did you really think I'd seriously date a maid? You were a game. A bet with my boys. And honestly, you made it way too easy. I trusted you. That's not my problem. He'd opened the door, gesturing for her to leave. Thanks for the entertainment though. You can go now. She'd run into the rain, humiliation and heartbreak crushing her chest until she couldn't breathe. She'd wandered Seoul streets for hours, crying, invisible again. Just a joke. Just a bet. Just a stupid girl who'd believed someone could want her. When she'd finally come home, she'd walked into a different nightmare. Now, sitting in her small room, Nuella replayed Jaemin's face over and over. The rage. The betrayal in his eyes. You're just like all the rest. He thought she was cheating. Sneaking around. That she'd betrayed his trust the way that woman had years ago. The irony was almost funny. She'd been betrayed, and somehow she was the villain. 3 days crawled by like 3 years. Jaemin wouldn't look at her. When she cleaned his study, he left. When she served breakfast, he ate in his office. The mansion became a tomb of silence and avoidance. Mrs. Huang watched with sad, knowing eyes but said nothing. Nuella performed her duties like a robot, cleaning, cooking, existing. The other staff whispered. She pretended not to notice. On the 3rd evening, something inside her finally broke. She found herself in the mansion's garden under the moonlight, surrounded by the white lilies someone had planted for her. The ones that appeared on her windowsill. She collapsed onto the stone bench and let herself shatter completely. Sobs tore from her throat, ugly, desperate sounds. For her father's death. For the debts that had driven her here. For Victor's cruelty. For Jaemin's cold silence. For being so utterly, completely alone. Why are you crying? Nuella's head snapped up. Jaemin stood in a garden doorway, backlit by the mansion's warm lights. His shoulder-length black hair was loose, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. His face was unreadable in the shadows. I asked you a question. He moved closer, and moonlight caught his features. His expression wasn't angry anymore. It was something else. Something careful. I'm sorry, she whispered through tears. I'm so sorry, Mr. Khan. I didn't mean to, I wasn't. Tell me what happened that night. His voice was quiet. Controlled. But underneath, she heard something desperate. So she told him everything. About Victor. The community center. The 3 weeks of feeling seen. The restaurant, the apartment, the mark on her neck. The bathroom wall. The bet. The cruel laughter. The humiliation of being someone's game. He said I made it too easy, she finished, voice breaking. Because I was just a desperate maid who should have known better. Silence filled the garden. When she finally looked up, Jaemin's face had transformed into something terrifying. His jaw was clenched so tight she thought it might break. His hands had curled into fists at his sides. His eyes burned with an fury that made the night around them feel cold. But when he moved, it wasn't away from her. He knelt in front of her, right there on the garden stones, and pulled her into his arms. Nuella froze, shocked into stillness. You will never suffer like this again. His voice was a promise and a threat. I swear to you, Nuella. Never again. She buried her face in his shoulder and cried harder, because for the first time since her father died, someone was holding her like she mattered. Like she wasn't invisible after all. His arms tightened around her, and she felt him press his face into her hair. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry I didn't know. They stayed like that under the moon, two broken people holding each other in a garden full of white lilies, while something fundamental shifted between them. Something that would change everything. Victor disappeared. Nuella didn't know how or why, only that within a week, the phone number he'd given her was disconnected, his social media accounts vanished, and when she'd walked past the bar where he'd worked, someone else was behind the counter. Victor, the new bartender had said when she'd asked. Never heard of him. She should have been relieved. Instead, she felt unsettled. Mrs. Huang had smiled knowingly when Nuella mentioned it. Some men dig their own graves, dear. They just don't realize it until the dirt starts falling. But Nuella's mind was on other things. The late-night conversations had started innocently enough. She'd been cleaning the library one evening when Jae-min had walked in, whiskey in hand, and simply sat down in one of the leather chairs. He hadn't told her to leave. So she'd kept dusting, hyper-aware of his presence. My mother died when I was 12, he'd said suddenly, staring into his glass. Brain aneurysm. One moment she was laughing at breakfast. 6 hours later, she was gone. Nuella's hands had stilled on the bookshelf. My father blamed me. Said I'd stressed her with my poor grades. Jae-min's laugh was bitter. I was 12. After that, he threw himself into business and left me with Mrs. Huang. I learned early that love was a luxury I couldn't afford. I'm sorry, Nuella had whispered. Don't be. It made me strong. But his eyes had looked so tired. So lonely. She'd sat down in the chair across from him without thinking. My father used to say that strength without tenderness is just cruelty wearing a mask. Jae-min had looked at her then, really looked, and something had shifted in his expression. Tell me about him. So she had. About her father's booming laugh that could fill a room. About how he'd taught her to cook jollof rice, insisting the secret was in the love you stirred in. About the debts that had killed him slowly, the shame he'd carried, the funeral she'd barely been able to afford. He sounds like a good man who made bad choices, Jae-min had said quietly. He was human. Nuella had wiped her eyes. Aren't we all? That night had become a ritual. Every evening, after the staff left, they'd meet in the library. Sometimes they talked for hours. Other times, they sat in comfortable silence, reading. He told her about hostile corporate takeovers and the loneliness of power. She told him about Lagos markets bursting with color, her mother's strength, the music of home she missed desperately. You make Nigeria sound beautiful, he'd said one night. It is. But so is this. She gestured to the books surrounding them. You've built something here. A sanctuary. It's just a house. No. It's a fortress. And you've been inside it alone for too long. His hand had reached across the space between their chairs, stopping just short of touching hers. They'd both stared at the gap, mere inches that felt like miles. Then his phone had rung, and the moment had shattered. But the next morning, Nuella had found fresh mangoes on the kitchen counter, her favorite fruit, impossible to find in Seoul, expensive to import. No note. But she'd known. She'd started leaving his coffee exactly how he liked it, black, 2 sugars, in the specific mug he preferred but never asked for. Their silent language deepened. One rainy evening, Nuella had been cutting flowers in the garden when the sky opened up. She'd run for cover, but strong hands had caught her waist, pulling her against a solid chest. Jae-min's suit jacket had appeared over her head, shielding her from the downpour. They'd stood there, pressed together under the inadequate cover, rain soaking them both anyway. His dark eyes had dropped to her lips. Her breath had caught. Nuella, his voice had been rough, wanting. His phone had rung again. Always the phone. He'd stepped back, jaw tight with frustration, and answered it. Business. Always business. But that night, he'd taken her somewhere new. "Where are we going?" she'd asked as his private car wound through Seoul's streets. "Somewhere they won't whisper about us." The rooftop restaurant had been closed to the public, but the owner had greeted Jae-min like an old friend. They'd sat under string lights with the city sprawling below them, eating food she couldn't pronounce and drinking wine that tasted like starlight. "This is dangerous," she'd whispered. "I know." He'd taken her hand across the table, threading their fingers together. "I don't care anymore. Your business partners are already asking questions. The staff talks. Mrs. Huang warned me. Let them talk." His thumb had stroked across her knuckles, sending electricity up her arm. "I've spent my entire life doing what's appropriate. What's expected. I'm tired, Nuella." "Of what?" "Being alone." Their secret dates multiplied. Midnight drives along the Han River, windows down, music playing. Private viewings at art galleries where he'd explain the paintings and she'd argue with his interpretations until he laughed. A hidden bookstore where they discovered they both loved the same poet. Physical boundaries blurred. His arm around her waist as they walked. Her head on his shoulder in the car. Foreheads pressed together in quiet moments. His fingers brushing hair from her face. But never more. Not yet. "I want to do this right," he'd said one night, cupping her face in his hands. "You're not a secret I'm ashamed of. He'd struggled for words. "You're everything I didn't know I needed." Nuella had felt her heart crack open. "Then why does it feel like we're hiding?" "Because I need to protect you from my world before I make you part of it." She hadn't understood then. Not really. Mrs. Huang's warnings grew more frequent. "Be careful, child. His world is beautiful but brutal. Men like him have enemies you can't see. He wouldn't hurt me. Not intentionally." The older woman's eyes had been sad. "But proximity to power has its price." Nuella had dismissed it. She'd been floating, high on stolen moments and whispered confessions. On the way Jae-min looked at her like she was the only real thing in his manufactured world. She didn't notice the small things. Documents occasionally out of place in Jae-min's study. Conversations that ended abruptly when she entered rooms. The way Mrs. Huang sometimes watched them with an expression Nuella couldn't quite read. The black car that appeared across the street at exactly 2:10 a.m., 3 nights in a row. She was too happy to see the shadows gathering. Too in love to realize that in Jae-min's world, happiness was a luxury that always came with a price. And somewhere in the darkness, that bill was coming due. The cracks started small. A confidential meeting about Jae-min's expansion into Vietnamese ports. Somehow, his biggest competitor had launched their bid the day before. Just bad timing, his CFO had said, but Jae-min's eyes had narrowed. A shipment of electronics worth 30 million won, rerouted to the wrong warehouse. Clerical error, the logistics manager had explained. Jae-min had fired him anyway. Then his offshore account in the Caymans, the one only 3 people knew existed, had been accessed from an IP address in Singapore. For exactly 47 seconds before his security protocols kicked in. Nothing was taken, his cybersecurity team had assured him. Whoever it was, they were just testing your defenses. Jae-min had pulled all the security footage from the mansion. Hours and hours of recordings. Nothing obvious. No strangers entering. No staff behaving suspiciously. But his instincts, the same instincts that had kept him alive in Korea's underground world, screamed that something was wrong. He'd started sleeping with a gun under his pillow. "You look exhausted," Nuella had whispered one night in the library, their stolen sanctuary. "Someone's coming for me." He'd said it casually, but his hand had tightened on his whiskey glass. I can feel it. I just don't know who. She'd moved to sit beside him, her presence a comfort he'd never expected to need. Then we'll face it together. No. His voice had been sharp. If something happens, you stay out of it. Promise me. Jaemin. Promise me, Nuella. She'd promised, even though they both knew she was lying. 3 nights later, Nuella woke at 2:10 a.m., her bladder uncomfortably full. She'd shuffled to the bathroom, still half asleep, and paused at the window. A black sedan sat across the street. Headlights off. Engine running, she could see the exhaust in the cold air. Watching. Her blood had run cold. The next morning, she'd told Jaemin over breakfast, keeping her voice low so the other staff wouldn't hear. His face had drained of color. What time? 2:10 exactly. Fuck. He'd stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his coffee. That's the 3rd time this week. 3rd time. I've been watching the security feeds. His jaw had clenched. Same car. Same time. Always gone by dawn. He'd doubled the security that day. New cameras. New guards. But Nuella had seen the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand kept drifting to the gun he'd started carrying. He trusted no one. A week later, everything shattered. Nuella had been cleaning the 2nd floor late into the evening, the staff had already left, and the mansion felt like a tomb. She'd been heading to her room when she passed Mrs. Huang's private office. The door was cracked open. Light spilled into the hallway. And she'd heard Mrs. Huang's voice, low and urgent. The girl is getting too close to him. Nuella had frozen. No, we can't wait any longer. Mrs. Huang's tone had been sharp, commanding, nothing like her usual gentle warmth. She's complicating things. He's in love with her, can't you see? We need to move faster. Nuella's heart had begun to pound. She'd pressed herself against the wall, barely breathing. Once we have the offshore codes, we'll frame her for the theft. Mrs. Huang had laughed, a cold, bitter sound Nuella had never heard from her before. She'll be deported within 48 hours. Jaemin will be devastated, distracted. And he'll never suspect us. Us. Is the syndicate ready? Mrs. Huang continued. Good. Tell them we'll have everything they need within the week. Bank accounts, shipping routes, offshore holdings, client lists, everything. Once we've bled him dry, they can move in for the kill. Nuella had felt the world tilt sideways. 20 years. Mrs. Huang's voice had dropped to a whisper, venomous and ancient. I've waited 20 years for this. His father destroyed my family's company. My husband killed himself when we lost everything. My children won't speak to me because I couldn't give them the life they deserved. Silence. So yes, I raised Jaemin, fed him, clothed him, wiped his tears when his mother died. Do you know how much I hated every second? Watching him grow up with everything while my family had nothing. Her voice had cracked. But I smiled. I played the loyal servant. I waited. And now, finally, I'm going to burn everything he loves from the inside. Nuella had clapped a hand over her mouth to keep from gasping. The African girl is perfect, Mrs. Huang continued, businesslike again. Foreign. Desperate. No connections in Korea. When the documents are found in her room, no one will question it. She'll disappear, and Jaemin will be too broken to see the real attack coming. The conversation had ended. Footsteps had approached the door. Nuella had run. She'd made it to her room, locked the door, and collapsed against it, her entire body shaking. Mrs. Huang. The woman who'd welcomed her, who'd taught her Korean recipes, who'd comforted her when she was homesick. A liar. A traitor. A woman who'd spent 20 years planning murder from the inside. And Nuella was supposed to be the scapegoat. She'd sat on her bed, mind racing. Who could she tell? Who would believe her? Mrs. Huang had raised Jaemin. She was family. Nuella was just the foreign maid he'd been sleeping with. But if she stayed silent, they'd both be destroyed. That night, she'd waited until 3 a.m., then crept to Jaemin's room and knocked. He'd opened the door instantly, gun in hand, before recognizing her. Nuella? What's wrong? We need to talk. Now. She'd told him everything in his private study, her voice shaking. Every word she'd overheard. The syndicate. The 20-year revenge plot. The plan to frame her. All of it. Jaemin had listened in absolute silence, his face carved from stone. When she finished, he stood and walked to the window, staring out at the Seoul skyline. His shoulders had been rigid. His hands clenched into fists. Jaemin? She'd approached carefully. Say something. She raised me. His voice had been hollow. When my mother died, she was the only one who held me while I cried. She taught me to tie my tie. She was at every school event my father missed. She was, his voice had cracked. She was all I had. I know. And it was all a lie. Nuella had touched his arm. He'd flinched, then leaned into her touch like a drowning man grabbing a lifeline. What do we do? She'd whispered. For a long moment, he'd said nothing. Then his eyes had met hers, and they'd been cold. Calculating. Dangerous. If she wants to destroy me, he'd said quietly, then let's give her exactly what she expects. What do you mean? A terrible smile had crossed his face. We're going to let her think she's winning. We're going to set a trap. And when it closes, his voice had dropped to a lethal whisper. I'm going to take everything from her the way she planned to take everything from me. How? Trust me. He'd cupped her face in his hands. But Nuella, this is going to hurt. I'm going to have to make her believe I've turned against you. I'll have to be cruel. Publicly. Can you handle that? She'd thought of the woman who'd plotted to destroy her, who'd used kindness as camouflage for decades of hatred. Yes. Then we fight. He'd kissed her forehead. Together. Outside the window, across the street, the black sedan appeared at exactly 2:10 a.m. Waiting. The performance began the next morning at breakfast. Nuella had entered the dining room as usual, carrying Jaemin's coffee. He'd looked up from his newspaper, and his eyes had been ice. You're late. I'm sorry, Mr. Kong. 3 minutes late. He'd set down the paper slowly. Is my time worth so little to you? The other staff members had frozen, unused to seeing him like this. It won't happen again. Nuella had kept her voice small, submissive, playing her part even as her heart cracked. He hadn't looked at her again. It had gotten worse from there. In front of Mrs. Huang criticized Nuella's cleaning. Her cooking. Her appearance. Every interaction was cold, dismissive, and cruel. She'd watched Mrs. Huang's eyes gleam with satisfaction, and watched the older woman start to relax. The trap was working. But God, it hurt. 2 weeks into the charade, Mrs. Huang's accomplices, staff members Nuella had thought were friends, had planted documents in her room. Shipping manifests. Account numbers. Corporate secrets printed on paper with Nuella's fingerprints carefully transferred onto each page. The discovery had been theatrical. Jaemin had burst into her room with security guards, Mrs. Huang trailing behind looking appropriately shocked. What is this? He'd held up the documents, his face twisted with fury that looked so real, Nuella had almost believed it herself. I don't know. I've never seen those before. They were hidden under your mattress. His voice had been deadly quiet. Corporate secrets. My offshore accounts. Everything someone would need to destroy me. I didn't put them there. She'd let real tears fall. Please, you have to believe me. Why should I? He'd stepped closer, and for a moment, his eyes had flickered, a brief flash of apology only she could see. You're just like everyone else. Get close to me to steal what you can. No. Get out of my sight. Mrs. Huang had comforted her afterward, in the kitchen, with poisoned kindness. He's always been paranoid, dear. His trust issues run deep. Just stay quiet, keep your head down. This will blow over. Nuella nodded, playing the frightened victim, while rage burned in her chest. Jae-min had ordered her confined to the servant quarters. No contact with him. No access to the main house except for basic duties, always supervised. They'd started communicating through notes hidden in a loose brick in the garden wall, the only place the cameras didn't reach. Day 3, stay strong. They're planning something big. I've hired private investigators. Day 2, I am sorry, for putting you this. Day 12, they've scheduled a meeting for next week. That's when they'll move. Day 15, I'm sorry for every second of this. If we survive, I'm yours forever. If we don't, know that you were the only real thing in my life. That last note had broken her. Nuella had sat in her tiny room, clutching the paper, tears streaming down her face. She'd wanted to run. To abandon this insane plan and disappear into Seoul's crowds. But then she'd thought of Jae-min, alone in his massive house, betrayed by everyone he'd ever trusted. She'd stayed. Mrs. Huang had grown bolder. The final meeting was scheduled, she'd deliver Nuella and the evidence to the syndicate, they'd wire the payment, and Nuella would be on a plane to Nigeria within 24 hours. Deported. Disgraced. The deportation papers were already forged. Police contacts had been bought. Immigration officials paid off. Everything was in place. Nuella had seen the documents by accident, left on Mrs. Huang's desk. Her name, her photo, the stamp that would end her life in Korea. She'd never felt more helpless. Late one night, alone in his office, Jae-min had pulled out 2 photographs. The first was old, faded, his mother, young and smiling, holding a 12-year-old Jae-min. Mrs. Huang stood beside them, kind eyes crinkling with genuine affection. Or what he'd thought was genuine. The second photo was recent, candid, Nuella in the garden, laughing at something, sunlight caught in her long black hair. She looked free. Happy. Real. He'd stared at both photos for hours. His mother would have wanted him to be happy. She would have loved Nuella, her kindness, her strength, the way she'd cracked through his walls with patience and stubbornness. Mrs. Huang had taken that from him. I had taken everything. He'd made his decision then. He would burn his entire empire to the ground if it meant protecting Nuella. The business, the money, the power, none of it mattered. For the first time in his life, Kang Jae-min had something worth losing everything for. And he'd be damned if he let anyone take her away. Outside, the black sedan appeared at 2:10 a.m., patient as death. But this time, Jae-min was ready. The counterattack had been building in silence for 3 weeks. While Mrs. Huang had watched Nuella with satisfaction, believing the girl was broken and isolated, Jae-min had been constructing a trap of such elegant brutality it would have impressed his enemies, if they'd lived long enough to appreciate it. The hidden cameras had gone in first. Tiny, nearly invisible, planted by a security team that owed Jae-min their lives. One behind the bookshelf in his office. Another in the light fixture of Mrs. Huang's private quarters. A third in the garden near the loose brick where he and Nuella left their notes. Every phone call Mrs. Huang made was recorded. Every whispered conversation with her syndicate contacts. Every detail of her 20-year revenge plot, captured in crystal-clear audio and video. She called them again last night, Jae-min's head of security had reported, handing over a USB drive. Confirmed the meeting for tomorrow. They're bringing the payment, 15 million in cryptocurrency, untraceable. They think it's untraceable, Jae-min had corrected, a cold smile on his face. The documents he'd discovered in Nuella's room had been his masterstroke. Real enough to fool experts at first glance, but embedded with digital trackers so sophisticated that every time someone accessed them electronically, Jae-min knew exactly who, where, and when. The syndicate had taken the bait beautifully. Within a week, he'd identified all 7 core members. Their locations. Their real names. Their actual business fronts. They'd been so focused on the treasure map they thought they'd stolen, they hadn't noticed the rope tightening around their necks. But the most brilliant part, the twist that made Jae-min smile in the darkness of his office, was the offshore account information. The numbers Mrs. Huang had stolen and passed along were real accounts. Real banks. Real money. Jae-min's money. But the access codes he'd accidentally left in those documents. They didn't withdraw funds. They deposited them into a maze of accounts Jae-min controlled through shell companies, each one monitored by international authorities he'd quietly contacted. The syndicate had been moving their own money into a trap, thinking they were stealing his fortune. Every transaction was documented. Every transfer was evidence. They'd built their own prison, one wire transfer at a time. "It's beautiful," his lawyer had said, reviewing the evidence. "Absolutely beautiful. They'll go down for international money laundering, fraud, conspiracy, attempted corporate espionage, we've got them on everything." "Good." Jae-min's voice was nice. "I want them buried so deep they'll need archaeologists to find them." But all the strategy, all the careful planning, meant nothing compared to what he felt when he finally went to Nuella's room the night before the confrontation. It was 2 a.m. The mansion slept. The cameras in the servant quarters had been accidentally disabled hours ago. He'd knocked softly. She'd opened the door immediately, as if she'd been waiting. Her long black hair was loose around her shoulders, her eyes red from crying. She wore a simple white nightgown that made her look impossibly young and vulnerable. "Tomorrow, this ends," he'd said quietly, stepping inside and closing the door. "But tonight, I need you to know, whatever happens, you changed everything." "Jae-min. Let me finish." He'd taken her hands in his, and God, they were shaking. Both of them. "I've spent my entire life building walls. Protecting myself. Trusting no one. And then you walked into my house with your battered suitcase and your stubborn heart, and you demolished every defense I had." Tears had spilled down her cheeks. "I love you," he'd said simply. "I love your strength and your kindness and the way you argue with me about poetry. I love that you make me want to be better than the cold bastard I've become. I love you, Nuella, and tomorrow I'm going to prove it." She'd pulled him down into a kiss that tasted like salt and desperation and hope. It wasn't their first kiss, they'd stolen moments in the library, in the garden, in the car during their secret dates. But this was different. This was a promise. A claim. A declaration that whatever happened tomorrow, they belonged to each other. His hands had tangled in her hair. Her fingers had gripped his shirt like she'd never let go. They'd kissed like they were drowning and each other was air. When they'd finally broken apart, foreheads pressed together, both breathing hard, she'd whispered, "After this, what happens to us? I don't know." He'd been honest because she deserved nothing less. "My world is dangerous. Complicated. There are people who'll come after you just to hurt me. I should let you go somewhere safe. I should. But you won't." Her eyes had held his, fierce and sure. "No." A smile had ghosted across his lips. "I'm too selfish for that. I'll burn down every bit of my empire if it means keeping you. I'll walk away from the underground connections, the dangerous deals, all of it. We'll build something new. Something clean. Together. Together." He'd kissed her again, softer this time. "I won't lose you, Nuella. Not to Mrs. Huang. Not deportation. Not to anything. You're mine, and I protect what's mine. They'd held each other through the night, not sleeping, just existing in the last moments of peace before the war. At dawn, Jae-min had returned to his room to prepare. The evidence was compiled, 17 hours of recorded conversations, financial transaction records from 6 different countries, forged documents with Mrs. Huang's fingerprints perfectly preserved, digital trails showing every member of the syndicate accessing the fake information. International authorities were ready. Interpol had been tracking this particular syndicate for 2 years. The Korean National Police had units standing by. Everything was synchronized. His lawyer had looked at the mountain of evidence and whistled. This isn't just a case. This is a massacre. Good. In her room, Nuella had dressed in the simple clothes Mrs. Huang had told her to wear, the costume of a guilty woman being handed over. She'd looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. 3 months ago, she'd been invisible. A maid. A shadow. Now she was the bait in a trap that would bring down an international criminal syndicate. Her phone buzzed. A text from Jae-min, "I love you. Trust me." She'd typed back, "Always." At noon, the black sedan that had been watching the house for weeks finally pulled into the driveway. Mrs. Huang smiled, straightening her hanbok with satisfaction. "It's time," she'd said to Nuella, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I'm so sorry, dear. But you brought this on yourself." Nuella had let herself be led into the mansion's conference room, playing her part one last time. The syndicate members were already there, dangerous men in expensive suits, their eyes cold and calculating. A deportation van waited outside, engine running. Mrs. Huang's 20-year revenge was about to reach its crescendo. She had no idea the symphony had already been rewritten. And Kang Jae-min was about to conduct a masterpiece. The conference room felt like a tomb. 7 syndicate members sat around Jae-min's mahogany table, their expensive suits and cold eyes making them look like death's accountants. Mrs. Huang stood at the head, playing the role of gracious host, her gray hair perfectly styled, her hanbok elegant. Nuella stood against the wall, flanked by 2 security guards Mrs. Huang had hired, men who thought they were there to prevent her escape. "Gentlemen," Mrs. Huang began, her voice warm with triumph. "Thank you for your patience. As promised, here is the thief who's been stealing Mr. Kang's corporate secrets." She gestured to Nuella like a magician revealing a trick. "And here," she placed a laptop on the table, opening files. "Is everything you paid for. Offshore accounts. Shipping routes. Client databases. Corporate secrets worth hundreds of millions. All stolen by this desperate girl who thought she could seduce her way into his empire." One of the syndicate leaders, a Russian with a scar across his jaw, leaned forward. "The money? Transferred to your accounts this morning, as agreed." Mrs. Huang's smile was victorious. 15 million in cryptocurrency. Untraceable. We'll verify that. Of course. And once you confirm receipt, Mrs. Huang nodded at Nuella, will be deported within the hour. She'll vanish, and Mr. Kang will be too heartbroken and distracted to notice his empire crumbling until it's too late. The Russian smiled. Elegant. 20 years in the making. Mrs. Huang's voice turned cold. His father destroyed my family. Now I destroy his son. Poetic, don't you think? Very. The voice came from the doorway. Everyone's head snapped toward the sound. Jae-min stood in the entrance, shoulder-length black hair perfectly styled, wearing a 3-piece black suit that made him look like an executioner. His face was utterly calm. His eyes were arctic. "Mr. Kang," Mrs. Huang's face was drained of color. "What are you doing here? This is a private." "You're absolutely right," Jae-min interrupted smoothly, walking into the room with the confidence of a man who owned everything in it, including the people. "She did steal something." He looked directly at Nuella, and for one terrible moment, she thought he'd actually betrayed her. Then he smiled. She stole evidence of your entire operation. The lights blazed on, every single one. The room became bright as an operating theater. And Korean National Police flooded in from every entrance, weapons drawn, voices shouting commands in Korean and English. Interpol agents followed, flashing badges. The security guards flanking Nuella stepped away from her and placed Mrs. Huang's hired men in handcuffs instead. They'd been Jae-min's people all along. The syndicate members surged to their feet, hands reaching for weapons that weren't there. Jae-min's security had confiscated them at the door. Sit down. Jae-min's voice cracked like a whip. They sat. The wall behind Jae-min lit up with screens, dozens of them. Security footage began playing. Mrs. Huang's phone calls. Her meetings with syndicate members. Her confessions about destroying Jae-min's father's company, about the 20-year revenge plan. Financial transaction records scrolled past showing every cryptocurrency transfer, not into the syndicate's accounts, but into monitored accounts controlled by Jae-min and flagged by international authorities. You didn't steal my money, Jae-min said conversationally, hands in his pockets. You gave me yours. Every transfer you made was documented. Every account you touched is now frozen. Every member of your organization is currently being arrested in 6 different countries. The Russian's face had gone white. This is impossible. No. It's just thorough. Jae-min's smile was a predator's. Did you really think I wouldn't notice a leak in my organization? That I wouldn't investigate? You've been feeding off information I let you have. Following a trail I designed. You built your own cage, gentlemen. I just locked the door. Police moved in, handcuffing the syndicate members one by one. They didn't resist, the evidence playing on the screens was ironclad. But Jae-min's eyes were on Mrs. Huang. She stood frozen, her elegant composure shattered. Her hands trembled. Her face had aged 20 years in 20 seconds. You raised me, Jae-min said quietly, and for the first time, his voice held emotion. Pain. Betrayal. I trusted you with everything. Why? Her mask finally dropped. Bitterness twisted her features into something ugly. Your father took everything from my family. Her voice was venomous. Our company. Our fortune. My husband killed himself because of the shame. My children blamed me. I had nothing, while you grew up with everything. So you waited 20 years to destroy a child who had nothing to do with it. I watched you grow up just to watch you fall. She was shouting now, decades of rage pouring out. Every birthday. Every achievement. Every moment of your happiness was agony. You don't understand what it's like to smile and serve the family that ruined yours. Then you wasted 20 years, Jae-min said simply. Because all you did was teach me that family isn't blood. It's a choice. And you chose hatred. Police moved toward her. You'll never escape this world, Jae-min, Mrs. Huang spat as handcuffs closed around her wrists. It will consume you both. You think love will save you? It will destroy you faster than I ever could. Nuella stepped forward then, moving to Jae-min's side and taking his hand. The gesture silenced the room. Then we'll burn it down together, she said clearly, her voice steady despite everything. And build something better from the ashes. Jae-min's fingers tightened around hers. Mrs. Huang laughed bitterly as they led her away. Foolish children. But she was wrong. Within an hour, the syndicate was dismantled. Arrests were made across 6 continents. Accounts worth hundreds of millions were frozen and seized. An international criminal organization that had operated for 15 years was destroyed in a single coordinated strike. And it had been done without firing a single shot. Just intelligence. Strategy. And 2 people who refused to break. When the last police car drove away, Jae-min and Nuella stood alone on the mansion steps, watching the sun set over Seoul. It's over, she whispered. No. He pulled her close. It's just beginning. 6 months later. The mansion sold for an obscene amount of money. Jae-min had signed the papers without hesitation, watching movers cart away furniture that had witnessed decades of secrets and lies. The new owners were a tech CEO and his family, people who would fill the halls with laughter instead of shadows. Any regrets? Nuella had asked, watching the for sale sign come down. Only that I didn't burn it down first, he replied, completely serious. She'd laughed, and the sound had made everything worth it. Dismantling his underground connections had been more complicated. You didn't just walk away from Korea's shadow world, not when you knew where the bodies were buried, both literally and metaphorically. But Jae-min had leverage that most men didn't. He had information on everyone who mattered, and he'd made it very clear that if anything happened to him or Nuella, everything would be released to authorities. Mutually assured destruction made for excellent retirement plans. He'd sold his shipping company to a German conglomerate. Liquidated his offshore holdings. Cut ties with the underground networks that had made him wealthy and kept him paranoid. Some had called him crazy. Most had called him weak. Woman over power, one former associate had sneered during their final meeting. You've gone soft, Kong. Jae-min smiled and walked away without responding. He'd learned that some people would never understand that strength came in different forms. The Second Chance Foundation had been Nuella's idea. We both know what it's like to be desperate, she'd said one night, curled against him in their new apartment, smaller than the mansion, but filled with warmth. To need help and find only exploitation. What if we could be different? They'd started small. An office in Itaewon, the international district where Nuella had first met Victor. A staff of 3, themselves and a lawyer who specialized in immigration law. Their mission was simple: help immigrant workers and women escaping exploitation. Provide legal assistance. Job training. Mental health support. A safe place to land when the world felt hostile. Word spread quickly in the immigrant community. The foundation that actually helped instead of making promises. The Korean man and African woman who'd survived their own nightmares and understood what it meant to be vulnerable in a foreign land. Within 6 months, they'd helped 43 people. Secured work visas. Stopped deportations. Helped women escape abusive employers. Connected families separated by borders and bureaucracy. The office walls were covered with photos now, faces from Nigeria, the Philippines, Vietnam, Myanmar, Bangladesh. Smiling faces. Grateful faces. Faces that had found hope when they'd almost given up. Nuella looked at those photos every morning and remembered the girl who'd arrived at Incheon airport with a battered suitcase and overwhelming fear. She'd been one of them once. Now she helped make sure their stories ended differently. Jae-min had changed too, in ways that surprised even him. The cold corporate titan who trusted no one had learned to laugh. To relax. To sleep without a gun under his pillow. He still had nightmares sometimes, of Mrs. Huang's face when she was arrested, of the years he'd wasted building walls. But Nuella was always there when he woke, her hand finding him in the darkness, reminding him that the past was gone and the future was theirs to write. They'd gotten married quietly. No big ceremony. Just them, a courthouse, and 2 witnesses they'd pulled off the street. I don't need a spectacle, Jae-min had said, sliding the ring onto her finger. I just need you. The ring was simple, white gold with a single diamond. But it meant everything. Now, on a Friday evening in late autumn, they stood together in their foundation office, preparing to close for the weekend. The Seoul skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, city lights reflecting like fallen stars. Nuella was locking file cabinets while Jae-min checked emails, his shoulder-length hair tied back, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of the expensive suits he'd once lived in. Ready? She asked, grabbing her bag. He looked up from his laptop, and something in his expression made her pause. What? Come here. She crossed to him, and he pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her waist. Through the window behind them, Seoul pulsed with life, millions of people chasing money, power, success. They'd once been among them. I spent my whole life believing love made men weak, Jae-min said quietly, his forehead resting against hers. And? Nuella smiled, knowing the answer but wanting to hear it anyway. You made me free. His voice was wonder and gratitude and truth. Every wall I built, every defense I maintained, I thought they made me strong. But they just made me alone. You tore them all down, and instead of destroying me, you gave me something I never thought I'd have. What's that? Peace. He kissed her softly. A life worth living instead of just surviving. She touched his face, this beautiful, complicated man who'd chosen her over everything. We saved each other. Yeah. He smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. We did. They locked the office doors together and walked hand in hand into the Seoul night. Not running from anything. Not hiding. Not afraid. Just two people who'd found each other in the darkness and decided to build something better in the light. Behind them, across the city, the mansion they'd left behind sat empty. A for sale sign in the yard. A symbol of a past they'd chosen to abandon. Some people would say they'd lost everything, the power, the wealth, the influence. But standing there in the autumn evening, fingers intertwined, watching the city breathe around them, they knew the truth. They hadn't lost anything. They'd finally won. Because true strength wasn't in controlling others. It wasn't in building empires or maintaining power through fear and manipulation. True strength was in choosing love even when the world told you power mattered more. True strength was in walking away from everything you'd built to become someone better. True strength was in two broken people healing each other and then using that healing to help others find their own light. Nuella had come to Seoul desperate and alone, running from her father's debts and the violence that followed. Jae-min had spent 32 years believing he was unlovable, that trust was weakness, that isolation was safety. They'd both been wrong. And in being wrong together, they'd found something right. Where should we go for dinner? Nuella asked as they walked down the street, her long black hair catching the city lights. Wherever you want, Jae-min replied. I'm not in charge anymore, remember? We make decisions together now. She laughed, and the sound was pure joy. Some stories end with empires built and kingdoms conquered. Some stories end with revenge and destruction and the bitter satisfaction of watching enemies fall. But their story ended with something far more precious. Peace. Love. Freedom. And the quiet knowledge that they'd found in each other what they'd been searching for their entire lives. Home. Not a place. Not a mansion or a country or a city. But a person who saw you completely and chose you anyway. Who loved you not despite your broken pieces, but because those pieces fit perfectly with theirs. The Seoul night embraced them as they disappeared into the crowd, just two more people in a city of millions. But they weren't invisible anymore. They'd finally learned to see each other. And that made all the difference.